Which of these three do you think proved neighbor to the man who fell among robbers? He said, the one who showed mercy on him. And Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. The parable of the Good Samaritan is a parable with a moral. Go and do likewise. Ever since, it has been held up as a model of Christian charity and service. Yet, as we all know, actually doing it, actually being a good Samaritan in many situations is not so easy. After all, of the three characters in the story, only one of them did the right thing. So how did he do it? And why? And how can we become more like the Good Samaritan? To better appreciate this parable, it helps to know a few details about the setting and the characters. The setting of the parable is the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jerusalem is built on a high plateau in Judea. Jericho is an oasis town east of Jerusalem, down in the Jordan Valley. The road that people traveled in the first century between Jerusalem and Jericho was about 18 miles long. It descended 3,200 feet through rocky wilderness with many twists and turns. And it was a wilderness road, and there were many places, there were many points along that 18 miles that were perfect ambush points for robbers who wanted to prey upon travelers. And in fact, in biblical times, the nickname for that road was the Way of Blood, the Way of Blood. The victim in the parable had been robbed, beaten, and left for dead. Anyone who came upon him that day would have legitimate reason to fear that the robbers just might still be nearby and their life was in danger. Now, as for the priest and Levite in this parable, Jesus did not choose them in the parable because they were the worst people. On the contrary, he chose them because they were supposedly the best people. They were the official representatives of the temple, and their job required ritual purity. In Leviticus chapter 21, we read, quote, "The Lord said to Moses, speak to the priests, the sons of Aaron, and say to them that none of them shall defile himself for the dead among his people except for his nearest kin." And in Numbers chapter 19, we read, "Whoever in the open field touches one who is slain with a sword, or a dead body, or a bone of a man, or a grave, shall be unclean 7 days." So it was natural, therefore, for a priest or Levite to believe that if they tried to stop and help that robbery victim who they presumed was dead, they'd be disqualified from their job for a week. They thought their jobs more important than the poor man in need. But Jesus challenged that self-perception. He taught his own disciples in Matthew chapter 5 that he said that unless their righteousness exceeded that of the scribes and Pharisees, they would never enter the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus challenged his disciples to have righteousness greater even than the scribes and Pharisees. And it's in the parable of the Good Samaritan that, in part that he defines that. Remember, the question was, what do I need to be saved? And Jesus said, well, what does the law teach? And the man spoke the great commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, strength, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus went on to say, and this is what your neighbor looks like. And he told this parable. So Jesus taught his own disciples that they needed to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. And so it's ironic It's ironic that in this parable, Jesus lifts up a Samaritan as an example of righteousness. Because it's hard to overstate how much scribes and Pharisees, how much the religious Orthodox in Judaism despised Samaritans. And in fact, it was common in the first century for any Jew who would travel between Jerusalem and Galilee and directly between Jerusalem and Galilee sat Samaria. And Samaritans were so odious to observant Jews in many cases that they would actually travel this very road out of Jerusalem down into Jericho, follow the Jordan River north so they can go around Samaria and then come into Galilee that way. That's how much of an issue this was. And that's how significant it was that Jesus chose the Samaritan to be the hero of this parable. So what does the parable teach us? As I said at the beginning, the moral of the parable is go and do likewise. Yet we know that being a good Samaritan many times is hard. It's hard to do. And in fact, many times we're more like the priest and the Levite than we would like to think. We too have urgent duties that will not permit delay. We too have to-do lists so filled that we don't have a minute for anything else except our chores and our to-dos. We too don't want to get dirty. We too are afraid of stopping on a deserted road to help a stranger. We too find ourselves overwhelmed with the logistics of helping somebody in need. And so whether it's our job, our family, our school, or whatever, we tend to focus on the issues and problems of our own little world, which is fine. We have to do that. But the problem is that it blinds us to the needs of other people in the world around us, and that's the problem. And so commonly we overlook the person in front of us who has needs, and instead we pass by on the other side of the road, figuratively speaking. Literally speaking sometimes as well. The essential difference between the Samaritan and the priest and Levite was that the Samaritan was willing to allow his agenda to be put on hold at that moment for that day. We'll never know where he was headed because all we know is that he dropped his plans for the day in order to help the guy who got mugged on the road. Not only did he drop his plans, but he invested time, effort, and money into helping him. He spent time and effort bandaging the victim. He put the man on his own mule and walked the rest of the way, much slower than he would have traveled otherwise. He gave the innkeeper 2 silver coins, and we're told that each of them was a denarius, and a denarius was worth a day's wage. And so that's equivalent to 2 extra days that he worked on behalf of this man. So altogether, this Samaritan invested about 3 days of his life to the robbery victim. It's a challenge to us in this story. We're all good people and we want to help wherever we can and whenever we can. And I think that the main reason we don't act more like the Good Samaritan more often is that we fill our lives too full. We don't schedule in time to be a good Samaritan, so to speak. Love is often inconvenient. Anybody who's a parent knows that. And parents do exactly what the Good Samaritan does. They put aside their own agenda for the sake of their children. That's what parenting is all about. But so love is often inconvenient, and serving others usually takes time. And when our days and nights are too tightly scheduled, we have no time for mercy. And then, sadly, we pass by the need of the person in front of us because we're just too busy. So we need to be aware of that and pray over that and let that be a real challenge for us, because Jesus is challenging us in this parable to be more like the Good Samaritan. But we also don't need to wait for a robbery victim to come by. There are many other ways to be a Good Samaritan. And the church, in fact, at the end of the parable, when Jesus said, "Which of these three do you think proved neighbor to the man who fell among robbers?" And the scribe answered, "The one who showed mercy on him." The one who showed mercy on him. What counts, what matters, what this is all about is acts of mercy. And the church has delineated for us 14 works of mercy. 7 of them are corporal, 7 of them are spiritual. So there are many, many ways for us to perform works of mercy. Corporal works of mercy are 7. They're feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless, care for the sick, visit the prisoners, and bury the dead. All of those are works of mercy. There are 7 spiritual works of mercy as well. We're very familiar with the corporal works of mercy. The spiritual works of mercy, not as much, and we need to be. And so these are the spiritual works of mercy, and you should be aware of these. And you should look them up, and you should have the list. Spiritual works of mercy are to instruct the ignorant, to counsel the doubtful, to admonish sinners, to bear patiently those who wrong us, to forgive offenses, to comfort the afflicted, and to pray for the living and the dead. Not all of these require the same courage that it took for the Samaritan to stop on that road knowing that robbers may be nearby, but all of them are works of mercy, and all of them are things that we can do. So in conclusion, Jesus said, "Which of these 3 do you think proved neighbor to the man who fell among robbers?" And the man replied, "The one who showed mercy on him." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." The parable of the Good Samaritan is a parable with a moral. Go and do likewise. And the main difference between the Samaritan and the scribes and Pharisees was that the Samaritan was willing to interrupt his day for the sake of the wounded man. How about us? How about us? Jesus instructs us to love our neighbors as ourselves. And the truth is that can be inconvenient, but we are called to do the same. And the challenge is laid before us, even if it sometimes means that we need to lay aside our agenda for the day and follow someone else's agenda. Is there someone in your life who is in need of mercy? Go and do likewise.